Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I was the invisible child. While my brothers got everything handed to them on a silver platter, I was the one left to figure life out on my own. But when I decided to cut my parents off completely, they didn't just take it badly. They completely lost it, and what followed was beyond anything I could have expected. From as far back as I can remember, my parents treated my two older brothers like kings. I'm not exaggerating, kings. Birthdays were like mini royal events. Balloons, catered food, and enough gifts to stock a small toy store. For me, a card, if they remembered, and maybe a slice of leftover cake from someone else's party. I'd sit at the table, trying to force a smile, while my brother showed off their latest gadgets or designer sneakers. Everything in our house had an unspoken hierarchy. My brothers were at the top, and I was at the very bottom, beneath even the dog. I sometimes joked to myself. They always had new clothes that my mom spent hours picking out at the mall. I, on the other hand, got their hand-me-downs. And trust me, they weren't the kind of hand-me-downs you'd see on trendy thrift store racks. They were torn, faded, and occasionally stained. I still remember trying to patch up a pair of jeans in middle school because they were the only decent pair I had left. At first, I thought maybe I just wasn't good enough. I wasn't as loud or charming as my brothers, who seemed to effortlessly draw people in. I worked hard in school, though, and managed to pull off decent grades. I even helped out around the house way more than they did. But no matter how much effort I put in, I was still treated like an afterthought. My brothers, on the other hand, could do no wrong. There was one time my oldest brother, James, crashed my dad's car into a mailbox. I thought my parents would finally lose it, maybe yell at him or ground him for a few weeks. Instead, they brushed it off, saying, "Accidents happen." A week later, James had a new car, complete with a shiny red bow on top. Meanwhile, I was scolded for spilling a glass of water on the dining table. It was like living in an alternate reality where fairness didn't exist. The favoritism wasn't just obvious. It was soul-crushing. One Christmas stands out in my memory. My brothers each got a stack of neatly wrapped presents, video games, a drone, and even a pair of tickets to a concert they'd been dying to see. When it was my turn, I unwrapped my lone gift, a pair of socks. Not even nice ones, just plain white socks that came in a multi-pack. I remember sitting on my bed that night, staring at those socks and wondering if they'd even noticed how little effort they put into my gift. The worst part was the way they always managed to twist things around to make it seem like I was the problem. Whenever I tried to bring it up, my mom would say something like, "Oh, stop being so dramatic. We love all our kids the same." My dad would chime in with, "You know we do everything for the family." But their actions told a completely different story. It wasn't just about the gifts or the attention. It was about the message they were sending. I didn't matter. At least not as much as my brothers did. It made me question everything. My worth, my abilities, even whether or not I deserve happiness. I kept hoping things would change, that maybe one day they'd notice me or treat me the same way they treated my brothers. But the older I got, the more I realized that day wasn't coming. And the more I realized that, the more I started to resent them. Growing up in their shadow wasn't just lonely. It shaped the way I saw the world. It taught me to be independent, sure, but it also taught me that love and attention weren't things I could count on. Not from them, anyway. That realization was painful, but it was also the first step towards something bigger. Something I wouldn't fully understand until years later. I still remember the day I got my acceptance letter. It was this crisp, white envelope, and when I opened it, the words practically leaped off the page. Congratulations. I had gotten into my dream school, a university I had spent years working toward. I can't even describe the joy and relief I felt. All the late nights studying, the stress over finals, and the hours I spent juggling school and part-time jobs had finally paid off. I thought, this is it. This is the moment they'll finally see me. This is the moment they'll be proud. That evening, I gathered up the courage to tell my parents. I walked into the living room, where my mom was scrolling on her phone and my dad was watching TV. My hands were shaking as I held the acceptance letter out to them. "I got in," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of excitement and nerves. My mom glanced at the letter for about 2 seconds before handing it back. "Oh, that's nice," she said, her tone as flat as if I'd told her I was going to the grocery store. My dad didn't even look away from the screen. He just muttered, "Good for you." That was it. No celebration. No hugs. No words of encouragement. Nothing. I stood there, holding the letter, feeling my excitement drain out of me like someone had pulled the plug. Later that week, I overheard my parents talking about the extravagant honeymoon they were gifting my brother and his fiancée. A full week in the Caribbean, complete with a stay at a luxury resort. I couldn't believe it. They were willing to spend thousands of dollars on a vacation for my brother, but when I brought up the idea of helping me with college expenses, they said they didn't have the budget. I remember sitting in my room that night, staring at the acceptance letter on my desk. For years, I had worked so hard, not just for myself, but because I thought it would make them see me. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this would be the thing that earned me their approval. But instead, it was just another reminder of how little I mattered to them. That was the moment something inside me broke. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break. It was quiet, like the slow crack of ice underfoot. But it was a break nonetheless. From that point on, I decided I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep bending over backward for people who couldn't even muster up the effort to care. If they weren't going to invest in me, then I would invest in myself. I started applying for scholarships like my life depended on it. Every spare moment I had was spent writing essays and filling out applications. I picked up extra shifts at the diner where I worked, sometimes staying late to clean up just to make a little more cash. I even started selling some of my old things online, anything to scrape together enough money to cover tuition. When the time came, I packed up my things and moved out. It wasn't some big dramatic farewell. I didn't even tell them I was leaving until the day of. My mom barely looked up from her phone when I told her, and my dad just said, "Good luck out there." It was as if they didn't care that their youngest child was walking out the door. At first, it stung. I kept wondering if they'd call or text to check in on me, but days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. The silence was deafening. But over time, I realized it was also freeing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't constantly trying to prove myself to people who couldn't be bothered to notice. I threw myself into my new life with everything I had. Balancing classes and 2 part-time jobs wasn't easy, but it felt good to be working towards something that was mine. I didn't have anyone to fall back on, but I also didn't have anyone holding me back. Occasionally, I'd get a text from my mom, usually asking for something, help with her phone, advice on a recipe, things like that. But not once did they ask how I was doing or if I needed anything. It was clear that I was on my own. Looking back, leaving was the best decision I ever made. It wasn't just about escaping their neglect. It was about reclaiming my sense of self. For the first time, I started to believe that I deserved better, not just from them, but from life in general. But even as I moved forward, a part of me still held on to the hope that one day they'd realize what they'd lost. That one day, they'd reach out, not because they needed something, but because they genuinely cared. Little did I know that hope would lead to a series of events I could never have anticipated. By the time I graduated college, I had all but given up on the idea of having a real relationship with my parents. They didn't come to my graduation, didn't send a card, and didn't even bother to call. I wasn't surprised, though. I had learned to expect nothing from them, and in a strange way, that made it easier to move forward. I focused on my career and worked my way up in a field I genuinely loved. It felt good to finally have something that was mine, something I had built with no help from anyone. I moved into a small but cozy apartment, made a few good friends, and even started dating someone who treated me with more kindness than I'd ever experienced at home. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. My parents, however, remained consistent in their inconsistency. They never reached out to check on me or ask how I was doing. The only time I heard from them was when they needed something. My mom once called in a panic because she couldn't figure out how to back up her phone. Another time, my dad sent me a curt text asking for advice on buying a new laptop. No hello or how are you? Just what's the best laptop for under $500? At first, I tried to stay polite. I'd reply with a quick answer or offer to help. But the one-sidedness of it all started to wear me down. Every interaction felt transactional, like I was nothing more than a convenient resource they could tap into when it suited them. The final straw came at a family event I almost didn't attend. My younger cousin was getting married, and my parents were hosting a big dinner for extended family the night before the wedding. I hadn't seen them in months and wasn't sure if I even wanted to go, but my cousin had always been kind to me, so I decided to show up for her. The moment I walked in, I could feel the awkwardness. My mom gave me a quick once-over, then plastered on a fake smile and said, "Oh, look who decided to grace us with her presence." My dad chuckled, adding, "The one who never calls or visits. How generous of you to show up." I froze. It felt like the air had been knocked out of me. They weren't just brushing me off this time. They were actively humiliating me in front of our entire family. I wanted to say something to defend myself, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I plastered on my own fake smile and sat through the dinner, barely speaking. Later that night, as I lay in bed replaying their words, something inside me snapped. It wasn't anger or sadness, it was clarity. I realized I didn't owe them anything. Not my time, not my attention, not even my replies to their texts. They had spent my entire life pushing me away, and I had been bending over backward trying to hold on to something that wasn't worth saving. The next morning, I made a decision. I quietly blocked their numbers, removed them from my social media, and vowed to cut off all communication. For the first time, I wasn't doing it out of anger or spite. I was doing it for my own peace. At first, it was strange not having their occasional texts or calls, even if they were rare and shallow. But as the days turned into weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: relief. The constant knot of anxiety in my chest started to loosen, and I began to focus fully on my own life. That peace didn't last long, though. My parents weren't the type to let things go quietly, and their reaction to my silence was louder than I ever could have imagined. The silence didn't last long. I had been living in blissful quiet for about 2 weeks when my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. I hesitated before playing it, already dreading what I might hear. It was from my mom, and her voice was thick with forced emotion. "Hi, honey," she began, her tone dripping with exaggerated sweetness. "I don't know why you're ignoring us, but I just want you to know that family is everything. We're your parents, and we love you no matter what. We miss you. Please call us back." I deleted it without responding. A few hours later, my dad sent a text. Unlike my mom's attempt at emotional vulnerability, his was blunt and accusatory. "I don't know what your problem is, but we've always done our best for you. If you can't appreciate that, then maybe you need to take a long look in the mirror." The irony was almost laughable. They were acting like I had wronged them, as if their years of neglect and favoritism didn't matter. Still, I didn't respond. I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to let them manipulate me back into their lives with guilt and blame. When I continued to ignore their messages, the tactics escalated. My mom started calling my friends. One of them, Sarah, texted me out of the blue one afternoon, saying, "Hey, just wanted to let you know your mom called me. She sounded really upset and said she's worried about you. She mentioned something about you cutting them off. Are you okay?" I could practically feel the heat rising in my face as I read the message. My mom had no boundaries, not even when it came to dragging my friends into her drama. I called Sarah and explained the situation, assuring her that I was fine and that my mom was just trying to manipulate her way back into my life. Thankfully, Sarah understood, but the whole ordeal left me feeling exposed and embarrassed. Over the next few weeks, the guilt-tripping became a full-blown campaign. My mom left more voicemails, each one more dramatic than the last. One of them began with her crying and saying, "I just don't understand what I did to deserve this. You're breaking my heart." My dad sent another text that simply read, "Ungrateful." Eventually, I blocked their numbers. For a brief moment, I thought that would be the end of it. But my parents weren't ready to give up. They found new ways to insert themselves into my life. One day, I came home to find a handwritten letter stuffed under my apartment door. It was from my mom, and it was 4 pages of emotional manipulation. She wrote about how much she had sacrificed for me, how she had always tried her best, and how it hurt her to see me turn my back on the family. She even brought up my brothers, claiming that they were worried about me and didn't understand why I was being so cruel. The letter made me furious. I sat on my couch, gripping the pages so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every word was designed to make me doubt myself, to make me feel like the bad guy. But I wasn't the bad guy. I had spent my entire life being ignored, overlooked, and treated like an afterthought. Cutting them off wasn't cruel, it was survival. I tore the letter into pieces and threw it away. That didn't stop them, though. A few days later, another letter appeared. Then another. My mom started showing up at my workplace, waiting outside during my lunch breaks and trying to catch me as I left. The first time it happened, I pretended not to see her and walked straight to my car. But the second time, she cornered me. "Why are you doing this to us?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "We're your parents. Don't you care about us at all?" I stood there, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. "Do you care about me?" I shot back. "Because you've had 20 years to show it, and all you've done is prove that I don't matter to you." She gasped, as if I had slapped her. "That's not true," she said. "We've always loved you." "Words are easy," I said. "Actions are what matter, and your actions have always said the opposite." I walked away before she could say anything else. After that, I filed a formal complaint with my workplace, asking security to keep an eye out for her. I also made sure to let my building management know that I didn't want her or my dad on the premises. For a while, it seemed like things were finally quieting down, but I should have known better. My parents weren't the type to let things go. They were determined to claw their way back into my life, no matter how much damage they caused in the process. Their next move would take things to a whole new level, one I wasn't prepared for. It was an ordinary Wednesday evening. I had just finished a long shift at work and was looking forward to collapsing on my couch with some takeout and a mindless TV show. As I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, I noticed a familiar car parked near the entrance. My heart sank. It was my parents' car. I tried to convince myself that it was a coincidence. Maybe they were visiting someone else. But as I approached the front door of my building, there they were. My mom was sitting on the concrete step, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while my dad paced back and forth, his face flushed with anger. Finally, my dad said as soon as he saw me, throwing his arms in the air like he'd been waiting for hours, "We thought you'd never show up." I froze, my keys dangling in my hand. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, but I knew that wouldn't stop them. They would just keep waiting, or worse, follow me. So I took a deep breath and walked toward them. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "We need to talk," my mom said, her voice trembling. Her tear-streaked face might have evoked sympathy if I didn't know better. "I've made it clear that I don't want to talk to you," I replied, keeping my tone firm. My dad scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Don't you think you've made that abundantly clear? Ignoring our calls, blocking our numbers, and now this? You're tearing this family apart." "Tearing the family apart?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay composed. "I'm not the one who's been ignoring and neglecting someone for years. I'm just finally standing up for myself." That set off a chain reaction. My mom started crying harder, mumbling something about how she just didn't understand and how it was never like this before. My dad, on the other hand, went on the offensive. "You've become so selfish," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Do you even care about what you're doing to your mother? To your brothers? This behavior is completely unacceptable." I stood there, staring at them, feeling a familiar mix of anger and sadness welling up inside me. For a moment, I considered just walking away. But then something inside me snapped. I was tired of the same old script, the guilt-tripping, the blame-shifting, the refusal to take responsibility. "You want to know why I've been avoiding you?" I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "Fine, I'll tell you. Growing up, you treated me like I didn't exist. James and Mark got everything, the attention, the support, the opportunities. And me? I was just an afterthought. Do you know what it feels like to sit at the dinner table and realize your parents don't even see you? To know you'll never be enough, no matter how hard you try." My mom stopped crying for a moment, looking genuinely taken aback. But before she could say anything, my dad jumped in. "Oh, here we go again," he said, throwing his hands up. "The same tired complaints? You're too sensitive, you know that? Life isn't fair. We did the best we could, and you're still ungrateful." "Ungrateful?" I repeated, my voice breaking. "I'm not ungrateful. I'm just done. Done pretending like this is a normal family. Done letting you make me feel like I'm not good enough. Done being the one who always has to make the effort." My mom started crying again, mumbling something about how she didn't know and she didn't mean to hurt me, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. "Not anymore. I'm not doing this," I said, stepping back toward the door. "You need to leave." "We're not leaving until we figure this out," my dad said firmly, crossing his arms. "Fine," I replied, pulling out my phone. "I'll call security." At first, they didn't believe me. My dad laughed, shaking his head like I was bluffing. But when I actually dialed the number, their expressions changed. My mom stood up, clutching her purse tightly, and my dad muttered something under his breath about how I was being ridiculous. A few minutes later, the building's security guard arrived. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, and he didn't hesitate to escort my parents off the property. As they walked away, my mom looked back at me with tear-filled eyes, but I didn't budge. Once they were gone, I went inside and locked the door behind me. I sank onto the couch, my hands shaking from the adrenaline. Part of me felt guilty. It was hard not to after years of being conditioned to feel that way. But another part of me felt something else. Relief. I had stood my ground. For the first time, I hadn't let them bully or manipulate me into doing what they wanted. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. My parents weren't the type to give up, and something told me they were just getting started. Things didn't settle down after I called security on my parents. If anything, their behavior escalated. At first, it was subtle. Texts from unknown numbers that I assumed were them using new phones. Then there were letters that started appearing in my mailbox, each one filled with the same themes: guilt, blame, and a heavy dose of emotional manipulation. But the subtleties didn't last long. One afternoon, I was coming back from my lunch break at work when I saw them, my parents standing near the front doors of my office building. My heart dropped. I hadn't told them where I worked, which meant they'd either dug through my social media before I blocked them or asked around. They spotted me before I could turn around, and my dad waved me over, a fake smile plastered on his face. "We just want to talk," he said as I approached, his tone deceptively calm. "Here? At my job?" I hissed, glancing around to see if any of my co-workers were watching. My mom stepped forward, looking like she'd been crying. "We didn't know what else to do, sweetie. You've cut us off completely. We're desperate to fix this. This isn't the time or place," I said firmly, keeping my voice low. "You need to leave. Not until you agree to have a real conversation with us," my dad said, his smile fading. I shook my head, stepping back toward the door. "I'm not doing this." "Do you really want your coworkers to see this?" My dad shot back, his voice growing louder. That was the last straw. I turned on my heel and walked into the building without another word, my heart pounding in my chest. I told the receptionist not to let them in and asked a manager to let security know about the situation. But it didn't end there. A few days later, I spotted my mom in the parking lot of my gym. She wasn't even trying to be discreet. She waved at me as I walked to my car, like she was expecting me to come over and say hello. I drove away without acknowledging her, my stomach in knots the entire time. Their next move was the most unsettling. I found a note tucked under my car windshield one morning. It wasn't handwritten. It had been typed out and printed, which somehow made it feel even creepier. "You're destroying this family's legacy," it read. "Do you even care about what you're doing? Your selfishness is tearing us apart." That line stuck with me. The family's legacy. What legacy? Years of neglect and favoritism? A dynamic where two brothers were treated like royalty while their sister was treated like an afterthought? If that was the legacy they were worried about, then maybe it should be destroyed. I didn't know what else they were capable of, so I decided to take legal action. Filing a restraining order wasn't an easy decision. I kept wondering if it was too extreme, if I was overreacting. But every time I thought about their escalating behavior, I knew it was the right choice. When my brothers found out, they were quick to intervene, but not in the way I'd hoped. James, the oldest, called me one evening, his tone dripping with exasperation. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded. "Protecting myself," I replied. "By filing a restraining order? Against mom and dad? Do you have any idea how ridiculous that makes you look? They're the ones showing up at my job and my gym," I shot back. "They left a note on my car, James. I don't feel safe." "They're your parents," he said, as if that excused everything. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. Just talk to them. Fix it. You don't need to drag the whole family into some legal drama." "Easy for you to say," I snapped. "You've always been their golden boy. You have no idea what it's like to be treated like you don't matter." "Come on, that's not fair," he replied, but his tone was dismissive. "They love you. You just need to forgive and forget." I hung up on him. Mark, my other brother, tried a softer approach. He sent me a long text about how family was everything and how he wished I would stop holding on to the past. It was all so easy for them to say. They hadn't lived my life. They hadn't grown up being ignored and overlooked. They hadn't spent years trying to earn the approval of people who couldn't be bothered to care. For a while, I started to doubt myself. Was I being too harsh? Was I making things worse than they needed to be? But every time I thought about caving in, I remembered the fear I felt when I saw my mom at the gym, or the anger that surged through me when I read that note on my car. No, I wasn't the problem. They were, and cutting them off was the only way to protect my peace. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. My parents had already proven they weren't willing to let go easily, and deep down, I knew they had more tricks up their sleeves. The question wasn't if they would escalate again, it was how far they would go. Months passed, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally exhale. No unexpected visits, no guilt-laden voicemails, no tense confrontations in my workplace or gym. The silence wasn't just peaceful, it was liberating. I poured myself into my work, deepened my friendships, and started rediscovering parts of myself I'd buried under years of family drama. I had assumed that this quiet meant my parents had finally accepted my decision to cut ties. Maybe they had gotten tired of chasing me, or perhaps they had just moved on. Either way, I didn't dwell on it. I was too busy rebuilding my life to spare much thought for the wreckage I had left behind. Then, one afternoon, as I sifted through the usual stack of bills and junk mail, I noticed an envelope with my mother's handwriting on it. I froze, staring at the familiar slanted script that had once labeled my childhood lunchboxes. Curiosity outweighed caution, and I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a neatly folded letter, written on stationery I vaguely recognized from her desk at home. As I read the first few lines, my stomach flipped. It was an apology. The words felt surreal, like they didn't belong to her. She admitted they had treated me unfairly, acknowledging the favoritism that had always been the unspoken truth in our family. She wrote about how she regretted the way things had turned out and how much she missed me. But the part that truly shocked me was when she mentioned therapy. My mother, who had always dismissed mental health as nonsense, claimed she had started seeing a counselor. "I've been learning a lot about myself," she wrote. "I never realized how much damage my actions or inactions might have caused. I'm truly sorry for the ways I failed you." I reread the letter twice, searching for any trace of manipulation or passive aggressiveness. But there was none. For once, her words seemed sincere. And yet, I couldn't help but feel conflicted. Could people like my parents really change? Could years of neglect and favoritism be undone by a few therapy sessions and a heartfelt letter? I folded the letter and placed it on my kitchen counter, unsure what to do next. Over the next few days, the letter became a constant presence in my mind. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hope that this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I could finally have the parents I'd always wanted. But another part of me, the part that had spent years patching up the scars they left behind, couldn't shake the feeling that it was too little too late. I decided to test the waters. I wrote a short reply, thanking her for the apology and acknowledging the effort it must have taken to write it. But I was careful not to make any promises. "Trust takes time to rebuild," I wrote. "I'm open to the possibility, but I need to see actions, not just words." A week later, I received another letter. This time it was from both of them. My mom wrote about the steps she was taking in therapy and how she had started reflecting on her own upbringing and the ways it had influenced her parenting. My dad's portion was shorter and less emotional, but he apologized for not always being fair and admitted that he could have done better. It felt strange, unreal, even to see my father acknowledge any wrongdoing. He had always been so stubborn, so convinced of his own righteousness. And yet, here he was, admitting fault in his own clumsy way. The letters continued over the next couple of months. They wrote about the changes they were trying to make and even asked questions about my life, things they had never bothered to ask before. "How's work? Have you picked up any new hobbies?" It was a stark contrast to the years of indifference I had grown used to. Still, I kept my distance. I didn't want to rush back into a relationship with them only to be hurt all over again. Instead, I took things slowly, responding to some letters and ignoring others. As time went on, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, people could change. But that hope was tempered by caution. After all, words were easy. It was the follow-through that really mattered. And while their letters were a step in the right direction, they were just that, a step. I wasn't ready to let my guard down yet, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. Even as I tried to remain hopeful, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that this wasn't the end of the story. It rarely was with my parents. For better or worse, they had always been unpredictable. And as much as I wanted to believe in their sincerity, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the blank sheet of paper in front of me. The letter from my mom sat nearby, folded neatly, but still weighing heavily on my mind. Her words, apologies, regrets, and promises of change lingered in my head like an echo. I had spent so much of my life wishing for acknowledgement, for any sign that my feelings mattered to them. And now here it was, but I couldn't shake my doubt. What if this was just another tactic? What if they said all the right things now, only to revert to their old ways once I let my guard down? After a long pause, I picked up my pen and began writing. I kept it short, thanking her for the apology and acknowledging the effort it must have taken to write it. "I appreciate what you've said," I wrote, "but trust takes time to rebuild. I'm open to the possibility of repairing our relationship, but I need to see consistent effort." I mailed the letter the next day, half expecting that it would go unanswered or spark a defensive response. To my surprise, my mom replied within a week. Her tone was patient, understanding even. She didn't try to rush me or demand more than I was willing to give. Instead, she wrote about her continued therapy sessions and the things she was learning about herself and her parenting. Her words felt genuine, and for the first time in years, I began to wonder if maybe change was possible. Over the next few months, we exchanged letters. They started out cautiously formal, like two strangers feeling their way through unfamiliar territory. But slowly, the tone shifted. My mom began sharing memories from my childhood, the kinds of things I had assumed she'd forgotten. She wrote about how she regretted not being more present for me, how she wished she had been more aware of how her actions affected me. My dad, to my surprise, wrote a few times as well. His letters were shorter and less emotional, but he admitted to mistakes in his own brusque way. I know I wasn't always fair, he wrote in one letter. I'm sorry for that. I'm trying to be better. It was strange seeing these small glimpses of vulnerability from the man who had spent most of my life deflecting blame. It didn't erase the years of hurt, but it was a start. Despite their efforts, I wasn't ready to see them in person. The wounds were still too fresh, and I needed time to process everything without the pressure of face-to-face interaction. My mom seemed to understand that, never pushing me to move faster than I was comfortable with. For a while, it felt like progress. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to have some kind of relationship again. I wasn't naive enough to believe things would ever be perfect, but even a small improvement felt like a victory. Then came the dinner invitation. It arrived in the mail one evening, tucked inside a card that read, "Thinking of you." My mom had written a note inside, inviting me to a family dinner at their house. No pressure, she wrote. Just a casual evening to reconnect. Your brothers will be there too. It would mean so much to have everyone together again. I stared at the card for a long time. Part of me wanted to say yes, to take that next step toward reconciliation. But the thought of sitting at that table, surrounded by the same dynamics that had caused me so much pain, made my chest tighten. I decided to decline, writing back that I wasn't ready for an in-person meeting yet. My mom replied graciously, saying she understood and that the invitation would always stand. It was a relief, but also a reminder that I was still walking a fine line between hope and caution. Things seemed stable for a while after that. The letters continued, each one building a fragile bridge between us. But just when I started to feel like we were making real progress, everything fell apart. It started with a text from my cousin, who had always been something of a family gossip. "Hey, just thought you should know. Your parents were talking about you at the last family gathering. They said you've been distant and overly dramatic." My stomach dropped as I read her message. I couldn't believe it. After months of apologies and promises of change, they were still painting me as the problem behind my family's dysfunction. At first, I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe my cousin had misinterpreted their words or exaggerated the story. But when I confronted my mom in my next letter, her response confirmed my fears. "I didn't mean anything by it," she wrote. "I was just trying to explain to the family why things have been difficult between us. I never said anything bad about you." Her words felt like a slap in the face. After everything we had talked about, after all the promises to take responsibility, she was still deflecting blame and minimizing my feelings. The final blow came when I found out they had been forwarding parts of my letters to my brothers, sharing the private conversations we had been having. My cousin sent me a screenshot of a group text between my parents and my brothers, where they were dissecting my words and debating whether or not I was being unreasonable. I felt sick. The trust one had so cautiously extended to them was shattered in an instant. I wrote one final letter, cutting straight to the point. "This is exactly why I was hesitant to reconnect," I wrote. "You promised to take responsibility for your actions, but instead, you've turned this into a game of damage control. I can't keep doing this." I mailed the letter and blocked their numbers again, this time with a sense of finality. For months, I let myself hope that things could be different, that my parents could truly change. But in the end, their actions proved otherwise. And while it hurt to close that door again, it also felt like reclaiming my power. I wasn't going to let them hurt me anymore. I was on my way home from work when my phone buzzed with a call from my aunt. She was one of the few family members I still spoke to, a neutral party who had always stayed out of the chaos between me and my parents. Her name lighting up my screen didn't usually trigger anxiety, but that day, something felt off. "Hey," I answered, wedging the phone between my shoulder and ear as I unlocked my apartment door. "What's up?" Her voice was hesitant, the kind of tone someone uses when they're about to say something you don't want to hear. "I wasn't sure if I should even tell you this, but I thought you want to know what your parents have been saying." My stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" "They've been talking to the family," she said slowly. "They're saying you've abandoned them, that you cut them off for no reason and have been making up stories about how they treated you growing up." I froze in the doorway, my keys dangling from my hand. "What?" "I didn't believe it," she added quickly. "I know you wouldn't do something like that without a reason. But they're telling everyone that you're ungrateful, that you've twisted things to make them look bad." I felt a mix of rage and disbelief wash over me. After all the progress we had made, after the letters, the apologies, the promises to change, they were still playing the victim. Worse, they were trying to turn the entire family against me. Why would they do this? I asked, my voice shaking. My aunt sighed. I think they're embarrassed. They don't want to admit their part in things, so it's easier for them to make you the scapegoat. I just thought you should know. By the time I hung up the call, I was seething. I had given my parents every opportunity to repair our relationship. I had put aside my own hurt and anger, extended an olive branch, and allowed myself to hope. And this was how they repaid me? By dragging my name through the mud and spreading lies to the rest of the family? That night, I sat down and replayed every interaction I'd had with them over the past year. The apologies that had seemed so sincere. The letters that had slowly built a fragile bridge between us. The cautious hope I'd let myself feel. It all felt like a cruel joke now, a facade they had used to regain control and maintain their image. The next day, I started receiving texts from cousins and extended family members I hadn't spoken to in years. Some of them were subtle, asking vague questions about what had happened between me and my parents. Others were blunt, accusing me of being heartless and selfish. Family is everything, one cousin wrote. How could you just walk away like that? Another text read, I don't know what your parents did to deserve this, but it's not okay to just cut people out of your life. It was clear that my parents' smear campaign was working. They were painting themselves as the victims and casting me as the villain, all while conveniently omitting the years of neglect and favoritism that had led to our estrangement. I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. I called my aunt back and asked her to let the family know the truth. I didn't want to air all the dirty laundry, but I needed them to understand that my decision wasn't made lightly. I can try, she said hesitantly. But you know how people are. Some of them will believe whatever your parents say, no matter what. She was right. Over the next few weeks, I heard through the grapevine that some relatives were sympathetic to me, while others had fully bought into my parents' narrative. It hurt to know that people I had grown up with were willing to believe the worst about me, but I also realized that their opinions didn't matter. They hadn't lived my life. They hadn't experienced what I had. The betrayal stung, but it also solidified something for me. My parents hadn't changed. Their apologies and promises had been nothing more than empty words, a performance designed to make themselves look better. I wrote one final letter, not for them, but for myself. I poured all my anger and pain onto the page, writing down every instance of neglect, every time they had made me feel small or invisible. It was cathartic, a way to release the burden I had been carrying for so long. When I was done, I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I didn't need to send it. They didn't deserve to read it, and I didn't need their acknowledgement to move on. I finally accepted that I would never get the parents I deserved, and that was okay. I had spent so much of my life chasing their approval, trying to fix something that was never mine to fix. Now I was done. Cutting them off again wasn't just an act of self-preservation. It was an act of self-love. For the first time, I wasn't making decisions based on guilt or obligation. I was choosing myself, and that was a victory they could never take away. It's been several years since I last spoke to my parents. When I think back to those turbulent years, it feels like I'm looking at someone else's life. The weight of their neglect and the pain of their betrayal once consumed me. But now, they feel like distant memories, scars I've learned to live with, but no longer let define me. In the years since cutting them off, I've built a life that feels authentically mine. It wasn't easy at first. For a long time, I struggled with guilt, second-guessing whether I had made the right decision. Society loves to tell us that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that cutting off your parents is an unforgivable act. But over time, I realized that those cliches didn't apply to me. Family isn't just about blood. It's about love, support, and respect. And those are things I had never truly received from my parents. So, I made the choice to create my own family, one made up of people who genuinely cared about me and wanted to see me thrive. I started small, focusing on the relationships that had always been steady and nurturing. My best friend Sarah became like a sister to me, offering endless encouragement on the days when the doubt crept back in. I reconnected with my aunt, who had always quietly supported me from the sidelines, and we built a bond stronger than ever before. Work became another cornerstone of my life. I threw myself into my career, finding joy and fulfillment in a job I was passionate about. The sense of accomplishment I felt was no longer tied to the hope of impressing my parents. It was entirely for me. Eventually, I found love, too. My partner, Alex, came into my life during a time when I was still healing, and their patience and kindness were exactly what I needed. They never tried to fix me or push me to reconcile with my family. Instead, they stood by me as I navigated the complicated emotions that came with my decision. Over time, the ache of losing my parents faded. It wasn't that I forgot about them or the years of hurt they caused, but I stopped letting those memories take up so much space in my mind. I stopped waiting for them to change, stopped hoping for an apology that would magically make everything better. Sometimes I still wonder if they've changed. I wonder if they regret how they treated me, or if they ever think about the daughter they pushed away. But I've come to understand that their growth, or lack thereof, isn't my responsibility. Even if they have changed, it doesn't erase the past. It doesn't undo the years of neglect or the pain they caused. And I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean opening the door to them again. It doesn't mean pretending everything is okay or giving them another chance to hurt me. Forgiveness, for me, has been about letting go. Letting go of the anger, the resentment, and the weight of their actions. I forgave them not for their sake, but for mine, because carrying that pain around was like dragging a heavy anchor behind me. Letting it go was the only way I could truly move forward. Now my life feels lighter. I've surrounded myself with people who love me for who I am, not for what I can do for them or how well I fit into their expectations. My days are filled with laughter, meaningful connections, and a sense of purpose. There are still moments when the past creeps up on me, like when I see a parent proudly cheering for their child at an event, or when I overhear someone talking about their close relationship with their mom or dad. In those moments, there's a pang of sadness, a fleeting sense of what could have been. But it doesn't linger, because I know that I made the right decision. Cutting my parents off wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about survival. It was about protecting myself and choosing happiness over obligation. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not bitter, and I don't dwell on what I've lost. Instead, I focus on what I've gained: freedom, peace, and a life that feels genuinely fulfilling. When I think about the girl I used to be, the one who desperately wanted her parents to notice her, to love her, to value her, I feel a mixture of sorrow and pride. Sorrow for what she endured, and pride for how far she's come. I used to think that being free meant cutting ties, but now I know it's so much more than that. Freedom is about reclaiming your own story, deciding how you want to live, and choosing joy even in the face of pain. And honestly, that's the best feeling in the world.